And we are live here on Plus One EXP's Roll for Content channel. My name is Tony Vicenda. I'm Chief Alchemist here at Plus One EXP, which is a weird little brand that multi-classes in tabletop game design, beard and skincare alchemy, and the Bardic College of Content Creation. Our hope and desire is to help amazing designers find great players who love their games, and amazing players find great designers whose games they can love. We do that in a lot of different ways, but my favorite way is actually just sitting down with one of those designers to talk to them about their work and what they do today. We have Noora Rose from Monkey's Paw Games with us live to talk about a number of things, including Chapbook Co-op, the Pink Hack, and what some of the words mean that we use all the time, at least from our perspectives. Noora, why don't you tell people a little bit about who you are, what you do, and where they can find you online?
Hey, thanks for having me on, Tony, as always. It's always a pleasure. So I run Monkey's Paw Games as a writer, editor, layout designer. I wear a lot of hats. Um, I also run the Chapbook Co-op, which is a amalgamation of myself, Drago from Ratty and Cantati, also in Canada, Jared from Spearwitch in the US, and Chris Bissett from Loot the Room in the UK. And we've teamed up with our limited resources to have slightly less limited resources to basically help with first time and specifically creators with marginalized identities to secure the funding for small runs of their TTRPG zines, um, which we do basically just in exchange for like wholesale copies. In addition to that, I've worked on a bunch of other fun projects, and most of the time I kind of shitpost on Twitter. Sometimes talk about design. Mostly I don't.
Awesome. I'm a huge fan of a lot of the work you've done. We've talked about it to you around itch funding, different anthologies you've had contributions to. I'm super excited to actually just sit down and chat to you a little bit about the work that you do. Let's just start where we always do, which always seems like such a contrived thing, but I think it's super important. Like, how did you just get started playing games? Like, what was your intro into the hobby?
Um, it kind of siphoned off through a combination of Magic and Warhammer when I was in elementary school, um, because all nerd hobbies tend to merge together at some intersection. Like I'm sure at everybody who plays one of those knows people who play others, kind of thing. So I remember first first I played the Dungeons and Dragons video games. Funnily enough, like I played Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale first before I really understood that there was like a tabletop game
Yeah.
involved in there. And then I played a little bit of D&D in high school. I had one good experience and several bad experiences, and that kind of soured me on it for a while until university. And then I had more terrible experiences in university, but I found some better people.
Okay.
So I kind of bounced really hard off D20 games as a combination of those two, but I was into Deadlands for a bit and Dogs in the Vineyard and World of Darkness and then I started running Dark Heresy and Legend of the Five Rings for a long time. Um, and then it's funny with both of those games, which I had like years long campaigns. Like I think I ran the same Dark Heresy game for 8 years, 8 or 9 years. Um, but we rewrote the game so much, and same with Legend of the Five Rings. We completely rewrote the game to fit our table. Um, and then I started blogging about that a little bit. But then as I got into the sort of creative scene, the design scene, I kind of realized that, well, I've sort of been game designing for like more than a decade at this point.
Yeah.
Um, because really, what's a rule book but somebody's house rules that they've had the funds to publish,
Right.
right? So and so that's kind of how I got into playing games and then writing them is that I realized that it's pretty much the same thing. It's just a matter of taking what you're doing at the table, um, how you're playing games, how you're running games, and then writing it down in a way that hopefully at least one other person will understand.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh,
so that's how I came to be.
Yeah, I love. Yeah, I think it's always interesting that line where all of a sudden you realize, oh, I've been doing the game
Mhm.
design. If at least if I took notes or wrote things down, or did the pieces you have to do, and you were doing some game design even if you weren't doing those things. But if you want to be able to publish what you've done, it does require you to actually write it down. I'm curious to know if you remember. You said there was a lot of like, oh, I had a lot of bad experiences in there. I think two things like. One, maybe what does a bad experience look like for you? Like, what are some of the things that made you want to bounce off gameplay really hard? And maybe then what are some of the things that kind of pulled you through and made you give it another try?
So my first, so I had basically I had one really really great GM in high school who I've actually sort of reconnected with sort of randomly in the last little bit. Anyway, shout out to Erica Muse, you're amazing. Um, but uh, then I had some pretty terrible experiences with just like the very basically when you picture like racist D&D players or tables, it's kind of what you would imagine, just this idea that like, oh no, there are no black people in this fantasy universe because it's European fantasy or whatever. So like I wanted to play an elf character that was black and that was just like, no, that's a drow. And I'm like, well, I don't want to play a drow. It's like, no, that's the only option that you have. And so I bounced pretty hard from that. And then similar sort of closed-minded experiences in college. But then as I started to find more tables and better tables, and meet people who were a little more open-minded, but also who like uh, were just willing to like the Dark Heresy game, for example, that I ran for the longest time, started out as I was like, I'm not gonna prep anything for any session. We're just gonna run it off the dome and see what happens, kind of thing. So it was all ad-libbed. Um, And that kept going for a long, 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 long time until we started to be like, well, I don't like this mechanism. I don't like that mechanism. Let's change it. Let's change some things. And then we had to start writing things down because we rewrote the rule book. Um, but so it was people that wanted to, A, that were open minded, but B, that um, were comfortable with kind of cracking open the book and saying, okay, well, this is what works with us. This is what doesn't. So people who communicate well and who are willing to um, share the game and share the story with everybody at the table sort of equally so that everybody gets their time to shine, they get their time in the spotlight, and also that like not holding on to um, the dogmatism of the rule books instead of being like, well, no, this is the rule and we're not going to change that because this is the rule, being like, yeah, this kind of sucks actually, like why don't we change it because this sucks and we don't like I trying to think of there was because there we did so much with Dark Heresy specifically. Um, I think it was like the sanity rules, for example.
Hmm.
There's some pretty. I mean, any sanity rules or insanity rules in a game is going to be inherently ableist, but Dark Heresy, I think, finds at least first edition Dark Heresy finds a way to be like hold my beer and take that to a whole other level of kind of ridiculousness. And we were all like, I don't really like this. So we changed it. And none of us were like, no, we're not going to do that. This is like crucial to the game. You have to do this. And we're like, well, we don't though,
Yeah.
and it's not fun. Um, like it's horrible, but it was also very much not fun because I don't know if you or anybody's familiar with Dark Heresy, but like if your character is has like the fear condition, you're basically sitting out combat. You're not doing anything, and that's not fun.
Yeah.
That's not fun at all. You're like, well, okay, I miss my turn for the next 8 turns because I'm so scared at the cosmic horror, blah blah blah. No, it's boring. That's very
Right.
boring.
No, I love that. Are there ways that you at your table, right, are conscious of that? Because I think there's a huge point. Like I would love to talk about it in design in a second. Some of the things you said, but that egalitarian process, checking in with people, and it can sometimes it's as simple as like we actually just treat each other like human beings and pay attention to each other.
100%.
But is there anything that you've seen for you be particularly effective in helping kind of set up that culture of play?
So, safety tools was a thing that, again, it was kind of a thing that we were doing without knowing that there was a word for it or that there was a thing that people weren't doing, even though like I played a lot of um, online games with strangers, and a lot of them were bad because they weren't doing these. And so I kind of picked up that like not everyone does this, but the one that I always use the most, I think, um, is or like formalized anyways, is like stars and wishes, and you don't have to do it every session,
Yeah.
but it's good to check in with everybody at the table, a during play, just to make sure everything's still going okay, everybody's still having fun, but especially like recaps afterwards, because sometimes you don't really like in the moment you might be fine with something, and then afterwards you're like, I'm not really feeling that anymore, or like you don't know how to put words to it. So I think check-ins, like post-game check-ins, or even pre-game, like the next time you get together, and just being like, hey, what do we think about this? Is this working? Is this not working? How are we feeling about how things are going? And just being able to adjust on the fly. And it does require buy-in and a little trust from the people that you're playing with, because it's not always easy to talk to, especially a stranger, when you feel some type of way about something, um, because you may not know this person, and you might think that, oh, like they've put so much work and energy and yada 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 into this, and they're gonna feel some type of way in return about me wanting to change this. But like if not everybody at the table's having fun, then like
Right.
something's gotta budge, right? So like I
I don't
think
want them putting a lot of work into me having a bad time or someone else having a bad time, and they
yeah,
probably don't
right.
want to be either.
Yeah, so it does, like it's not always easy to talk to people. I know I'm terrible at confrontation, but I found that that specifically is something that I think is really crucial to, um, especially keeping a game going long term, is just being able to, at the end of the session, at the end of the day, or even in between, just be like, hey, this really isn't working for me specifically. Can we adjust that?
Yeah.
And if you have a good table, if you've got a good group of people, a good group of friends that you're working with, because they're open and willing to hear you and not just shut that down.
Stars and Wishes is probably like a little bit of an unsung hero of toolkit stuff, because a lot of times, especially like I play mostly one shots, so lots of times we don't do it because it's like, hey, well that yeah, like we're not gonna play again. So,
Yeah.
um, but it does create a more reflective reality around like, oh,
Mhm.
I didn't like this, and maybe I didn't know I wasn't gonna like this until we got into that point of play, or just being able to hear from your players, here's the things I wish we had gotten up to,
Yeah,
or
totally.
from the GM. I was kind of hoping y'all would go behind this door, but you'll never know what was back there. I wanted you to. Those are kind of nice things to be able to hear and just give that space. And I was talking to Jason Morningstar last Tuesday in an interview, and I was talking about Fiasco's like role before the aftermath piece. And one of the specific things I talked about was like, it's so hard when you're in the moment of playing a game to be conscious of actually what's happening as you're doing it, because you're so focused on doing the thing that you're not necessarily taking the information in. So I love the concept of like recaps as a way to help even remind you. Like sometimes I'll say to players, "Oh, remember when you did that?" And they're like, "No, I don't remember
Yeah,
that at all."
totally,
And
totally.
so, did I do that? That's awesome. I love that. But they were so in the moment that they it's not something that they processed as, here's how I did that, or here's what I'm doing, or even how other people saw what I was doing. So, I love that. Let's look at that a little bit in design. Actually, in design, I'd love to talk about kind of like, as you stepped into designing, what are some ways you talked specifically about like some of the conversations at the table and some of the ways we kind of like push back and like say, hey, this is what I like from the rules. Here's what I don't like. Here's what we're going to change. For you as a designer, as somebody who plays in that mentality, does that go into your design? And if so, how do you kind of implement that to make things modular and give people explicit or just kind of implicit permission for that?
So I hope that in anything that I've written, that nobody feels like they need to ask, or implied or otherwise, my permission for anything. Because honestly, I'm firmly in the belief that they you might need to leave room for Jesus when you're dancing, but you don't need to leave room for the designer at the table. Um, the things I write primarily for me because I think that I would enjoy them, and then, um, but I try and write toolkits that other people might also enjoy, and then I hope that um, they at least find it interesting enough to, if not run as is, to pull apart and come up with something better than I came up with. And a lot of that comes from, especially when you're first starting to run games. There's this idea that you have to have a solution for everything. You have to have contingencies and plans for everything that players are going to do. Um, but you can't, and you'll drive yourself up the wall trying. But also sometimes, most of the time, people will come up with just better ideas than you have, and it's good to embrace those ideas. And I think that taking that from a GM's perspective and moving that to a writer's perspective is it's only doing yourself and everyone else favors when you acknowledge that like other people have good ideas, probably better ideas than yours, just law of averages. There's because there's more people, there's going to be more ideas. Some of them are going to be bangers. Not every idea that
Right.
you come up with is going to be good. Um, but just to provide the inspiration behind something that might spark a good or a better idea in somebody, like that's a that's a dub for me. Like if I write something that I think is kind of cool, and then somebody comes to me and like, hey, I took that idea and I made something better. That's like that to me. I love hearing that. I love hearing that people have taken something that I've written or even something I've written about and made something way cooler than I could have thought of. And I think that is kind of to me, that's the ideal of like game design or games writing is for somebody to hack your game and to make something cool out of that. That I think that's the best feeling in the world, that like you provided that little bit of spark of inspiration for somebody. Because that's all that, like it's like I always think about Monopoly, how everybody has different rules for free parking. And to me, that's game design because my table is going to be different from your table is going to be different from somebody else's table. And um, instead of trying to homogenize what happens in all of those tables, we should be trying to create the most diversity and difference between them because that's cool and that's fun, and it provides for like a an amount of yeah, like diversity in experience
Yeah.
rather than like this game is about. I hate this game is about. You don't tell me what the game is about. You don't know me. You're a book. I wouldn't, if a book told me to do something, I want to do the opposite, basically. You're not going to tell me what to do.
I love that. Like as somebody, like I'm putting out my uh first game that doesn't have, or we're publishing our first game. It's Marcus's game, Down We Go, that doesn't have a this is what an RPG is section in it. Which is like I love I'm somebody who reads those every single time they come up.
Oh yeah.
Because I love hearing what the creator has to say, but also I already know what an RPG is and I know how to sit down and play an RPG. So you're not telling me something. I'm just able to hear what your perspective as people are approaching this game is on this thing. It's also really interesting to think, man, somebody who's only ever played this RPG is going to think this is exactly what an RPG is and not know that there's a million other things an
Well,
RPG
and
is and
plus,
can
like,
be.
how is a book, how is a paragraph gonna tell you what an RPG is?
Right.
Like, it's just never gonna happen. I mean, plus the best what is an RPG has already been written, and it's the first page of Troika. Like,
Yeah.
that's as good as it gets, honestly. I don't think it gets any better than that.
No,
It's
no, but yeah, the what this game is about thing is always such an interesting thing. Like it's one thing to be like, here are the themes we explore, or here are some of the things you're gonna do, or the types of things you might do, right? Like I'm a huge
yeah.
fan of here are principles that go into the type of play culture we're looking to for people who play this game to develop. But I'm not interested in like here's like I having listened to like adventure tourism, right, and a lot of other people talk about this thing, it's like I have always been so against written adventures. Like I'll buy them, I'll read them. I've I don't think I've ever run a written adventure
Really?
except for on stream. And that I think the first one I sat down to like run was the Drain. And I was like, this is nice because I don't have to think at all. But I'm also spending more time having to take the information in than if I just spent 20 minutes sketching something out on paper. And the Drain is incredibly well done and
Oh yeah.
great fun. I mean, I've played a ton of written adventures also too, so I've experienced them, but I just was never somebody who ran them, right? I'd read them, I'd loot them for parts. But I just was, if anybody was ever like, have you ever run this adventure? I'm like, no.
I was like that up until about 2 or 3 years ago. And then it was DCC that really got me into it because I same as you, I had always taken things and stripped them down for parts. And then I ran Sailors of the Starless Sea,
Mhm.
which is probably it's a top 5 dungeon crawl for me. And there's something specifically about that one that it's so good, you can run it out of the box without thinking and have a blast, and everybody has a blast.
Yeah.
But then I ran it 2 or 3 more times in a short amount of time because I was trying to get a bunch of people into playing DCC, and it was totally different each time I ran it. And I was kinda like, "Well, hold up. I always thought that modules were more like about that homogeny that I was talking about earlier, but they don't have to be." And especially when you go back further to the pre-Dragonlance days, um, they're really not like that.
Yeah.
So, it was because, you read your Minds of Phandelver and blah, 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 like, or the adventure paths for Pathfinder or, um, the, like, tournament module type things for, like, 5th edition and 4th edition, that they're very structured, and I thought that's what a module was about,
Right.
and it doesn't have to be. Um, and even when there is structure, even when there are rails, like, Sailors is a very, like, you go here, you go here, you go here, you go here, and you just have a choice of in which order that you hit those points. But, yeah, the experience was so different, and I've probably run Sailors 20 times at this point, and, I have yet to have a group that has a exactly the same experience.
Hmm.
You get something new every time, and I mean, part of that is funnels are kind of designed to do that because it's so chaotic, but, also I just think that it's just a really, really well-written module, and I was kinda like, "Oh, I'm just reading a lot of really bad modules."
Right.
Um, and so, y yeah, it's so, like, and some people are still like, "Oh, no, I would never, like, I'm just gonna strip them for parts and move on," and, like, honestly, power to you because that's a lot of fun too, and the best modules have the best stuff to steal from,
Right.
basically, but, like, yeah, you should try it. I'll send you some of my favorites that you
Yeah.
just try and run them because
Well,
they're it honestly, it's even fun when everybody dies,
right.
basically.
Well, that's the thing. Like, I'm no longer ideologically opposed to them, but now, like, I'm running a stream, and so I'm not running the game, right? Like, and
Yeah,
so
that's
that's because
true.
that's one of our things. But like for my home games and for things around the house, like I'm like we're about to put out an adventure anthology for iToaster, which is the dumbest thing to put out an adventure anthology for in some ways, but I'm very excited about it. For one thing, people wanted to do it, and I was just like, yeah, go do it. And they were like, oh no, could you like organize it? And I was like, oh yeah, sure, right, whatever. But it's also the type of game that like I really enjoyed writing the adventure seeds, but that's the kind of stuff I look for is like
Yeah.
here's the 5 sentences that are going to get you started, and we're just going to see where the players go, right? But I do love reading them. Like for me, adventures are a thing that I've always loved reading, and I don't have any problem playing a pre-written adventure. Some of my favorite things, and DCC is a classic example. Like everything I've ever played in DCC has been something that came out of a book. I've never had somebody run DCC for me just off the top of their head. I would never complain about it, right? I'd never complain poor or well prepped about that. And I think I do love that reflection on like the chaos elements of it being an important thing. Like
Oh yeah.
players knowing they have a choice in how they're approaching these things is the thing. And I do think, yeah, a lot of times we were getting the really bad example of like, no, this is just about how you're going to fight this monster or overcome this social engagement.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the only choice you have here. And I was never interested in that. Real Meat
Playing
Castle.
Dragonlance.
Yeah,
Playing
right.
Dragonlance.
Right. Real Meat Castle says, before I published stuff, I never ran pre-made adventures, but now I really love running them, seeing how other people structure those, seeing how I can bend them into a shape like I like best was a big switch for me. Yeah, I think that's a huge thing. But I'd love a list of things that you think are great because the reality is more and more as we get back into playing games in person eventually, like as I'm playing with Home Table and other stuff like that, it's nice to be able to be like, yeah, we're just going to run this adventure and just being able to enjoy that is something that I have a blast doing. Like I said, and I love playing them. It's just I was never one to run them. And so
Honestly, if you want one that is a lot of fun to just run straight out of the box, it's Barrier Peaks S3.
yeah.
You just read it tonight, and when I have a feeling you'll shoot me a message when you get to the backward shooting ray guns, but I'm like, what am I reading? Like it might be the first like funhouse dungeon that TSR ever did. Is basically it's a crashed spaceship.
Yeah.
There's Rock'em Sock'em robots, there's ray guns, it's totally funhouse gonzo, but it's so much fun.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where like you just run it out of the box and you come into it with no expectations of like I don't know, narrative or whatever, and you're just like, yeah, no, you find a crashed spaceship and you're gonna go check it. You know, it's like in the Fallout games when you find the Zedans and you're like, oh, like in the what is it, Mothership Zeta DLC in Fallout 3,
Yeah.
and you just get abducted by yeah, and you're like, okay, so now I've got a samurai, a cowboy, and a robot, and we're gonna go fight some aliens. Let's go.
Yeah.
That's great.
No, I've heard great things about Barrier Peaks. It also is one I've never read, so I should actually take the time to sit down and do it. So, but let's use that as a jumping off point for another point in the conversation. A lot of people say OSR is anything you can run Keep on the Borderlands with. What is OSR for you?
So, yes, technically yes. So I'm a bit of a purist, even though I kind of disregard my own rules about this. But to me, there's really three or maybe four periods of the OSR. Um, because so there's the OSR itself, which is about 2000 to 2009, and then there's the post OSR, which is 2010 to like 2019 when G Plus ended, and that specifically is the period that I think everybody talks about when they talk about OSR because that's when you have DCC come out. That's when you have Lamentations of the Flame Princess come out. When you have all of these, so basically OSR is it's a retro clone that works with BX and older. That's it. That is that is what the original OSR came out of. Is because um, when D&D moved from like sandboxes to like more narrative stories, and then when they added the skill systems in Oriental Adventures and second edition, and then when the 3 and 3.5 edition Splat Creep started to change the game from being like down at heels sort of picaresque mercenaries to like the Fellowship of the Ring type, like powerful adventurers that can take on dozens of dudes at a time. The game totally changed, and the Grogs were mad. And then fourth edition happened, and the Grogs were madder. But the OGL happened in about 2000, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so first it was blogs that people started publishing retro clones because they're like, I just want to go and play BX forever, which is fine. Uh, and so they started putting out stuff on blogs, and then I think the first it was either Donjon or Castles and Crusaders in about mid like 2004 2005, and then you get you get White Box, Swords and Wizardry, you get Brain. There's a bunch of
All you
retro
get
clones that,
all the
yeah,
all the BX retro clones that pour out
that
during that
happen.
time.
And
Yeah.
then there was another ideological shift that it went from a design movement that was rooted in compatibility with BX and all the old modules to the feel of an old school game.
Right.
Um, and then you have your games that aren't BX compatible, but they do have the feel of these OSR games, and that's where these like design pillars come in. The sandbox, modular design and like lots of tables and randomization, no encounter balance, lethality is another one that people like to point to.
Right.
But none of those design pillars were part of the original movement because none of those design pillars are explicitly anything to do with BX or older editions. Those were just people trying to capture what it feels like to run Keep on the Borderlands back in 1981, but now in 2005,
Right.
2007, right? And so in this sort of post OSR scene, you had all of these games that were no longer just straight up retro clones. They started doing new things with the mechanisms, and the Grogs got mad. That's a big running theme in TTRPGs, right? And so that's where this sort of it shifted from a design ideology to a genre. Old school was a genre, and that happened until about the basically G plus collapsing in 2019 was like our Library of Alexandria. We lost everything from G plus. A lot of the good blogs shut down. It turns out a bunch of key figures were pretty awful, surprising
What?
nobody really.
Right.
And so now we're in, and this phrase is brilliant, but I give full credit to Chris Bissett for coming up in it. Is now we're in what I like to call the after school revival, where it is the there's it's less about the design ideology, and it's not even so much about the genre, but it's about the aesthetic of a
Right.
game. And this is like, you have people who are rediscovering not just the old TSR modules, but also games like Tunnels and Trolls and Empire of the Petal Throne and Advanced Fighting Fantasy, which is one of my favorite
Mhm.
games. Um, and all of these games looked like they were like put together in a church basement with like a really really cheap printing press, right? And so that there's that minimalist OSR design, and then there's the other side of that coin where you have your Morkborgs and your Electric Bastion lands and your games that are like um, I don't want to say overproduced because I think that comes across as pejorative, and I think that the design elements that the like art punk OSRs are doing
Yeah.
is really cool.
The,
But it's like how T-Pain used took the auto tuner and turned it into a genre of itself, right? And the
that's
no
like the best
yeah, and no
analogy I've
T-Pain slander
heard
because
for it.
T-Pain's the shit.
No, yeah.
But like what these designers are doing now is something really cool in that because you can look at say Morkborg and you're like, this is some old school stuff. You don't need to read it. You don't need somebody to tell you it. You just kind of understand that that's what's going on, and so it's old school as aesthetic rather than as genre. And there's marketing involved, but there's marketing involved in everything.
Right.
So that essentially is the OSR. The people talk about the OSR on Twitter a lot, and half the time they don't know what they're talking about, which is fine because that was 20 years ago, 22 years ago, right? B, it's a dead movement in the same way that punk is dead.
Right.
But C, it's like when you talk about the OSR, you're talking about when in the OSR,
Right.
not because it's a movement that really started in the 2000s with the OGL, but um, it goes back to 1985 with Dragonlance being
Hmm.
released and totally changing the way that TSR did modules. So this is a design movement that's happened over like 4 decades, right?
Right.
So um, So you can't just point at one person and say, "Oh, this is OSR, this is OSR," or you can, but it's boring because then you're just talking about BS retro clones, which, like, again, I love, but that's not everybody's
And,
cup of tea.
and even something we talked about right before stream, people are totally welcome to disagree with you
Yeah,
on any
totally.
of this. Like,
I mean, yeah, like you can say no, that's not what the OSR is, and honestly, at this point, I'm just gonna be like, "You're right. Have a nice day."
yeah. Because like for me, I've always focused primarily on, and it's specifically because I know that like I was around for some of the Google Plus days because I was a huge fan of Google Plus and knew there were game books on there, but I was not in any way, shape, or form in the middle of that community. I've read a lot of stuff people posted. I loved the fact that it existed. And then when I found out that everything was going away, I was sad, but I was not involved with game design or extensive gameplay at that point in time. So if somebody was like, were you there for that? Sure. Does it influence the way I design? Absolutely. Would I consider myself part of that OSR community? Absolutely not. Even though tangentially I wasn't engaged enough for it to matter. But like, does the old school style of play and a lot of the things that came out of that community tremendously reflect what I look for at a table? Do I look back at a lot of that stuff even as I'm designing now? Absolutely. And so for me, it oftentimes is that the marketing element or the play style, but I do think it's important to kind of start to distinguish between, okay, well, what are we talking about? And also I love the reflection on like that kind of goes back to Dragonlance, right? Like this is the way that elf games like have continually kind of tried to rebirth themselves every 10 to 15 years in a new way, and we're going to constantly and continually see that. My favorite one is when people get asked to define OSR play and they're like, well, I've been playing since the 70s, so I can tell you exactly what OSR is. And I'm like, wait, but the 70s are not what
Yeah, well, you're not.
OSR is
That's
talking
just
about.
old. That's not old school. That's just old.
Like,
It's
that's
like,
just all.
yeah, sure. Yeah. That's just the O. That's not the SR. The R is very important in this sentence.
Yeah. um Odin's Beard, drop that to me over on Discord so I can post it in the chat. I have links turned off for everybody else, but I'll drop it in. The No, I like I said, I think those types of understandings are important because, like, for me, a lot of times people try to use the most minimal one, like I immediately go to sociological studies. I'm like, well, that's not really long enough for cohorting. For cohorting, we need a period of at least 15 to 20 years, all of which is bullshit because it's a soft science. So sometimes cohorting happens way faster or way longer.
Yeah.
But I think that's a lot of what we see is like people who will debate about zennials, which I think is a totally made up. I mean, we can get into weird sociological stuff. It's a made up thing in one article in Australia that makes elder millennials feel really good about not being millennials and willing to shit on other people who are. It's great. It's a great thing. It doesn't matter, and it's all bullshit, and it's all kind of made up. We're talking
It's
about
all made up.
we're also not talking about individuals. We're talking about broader cultural movements, and so in a lot of ways, those are reflexive, and we know they're emerging, but we don't really understand them until we're 20 or 30 years past them a lot of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we can talk a lot about how, uh, you know, about 1985 to 1987 or 89, I think, when Oriental Adventures in Second Edition came out, was like very formative for how the Dragon game is played now because you're introducing the skill system for one, which was never a thing. Um, and but now, like a lot of people, you can't imagine D&D without like, oh well, what skills do I have available? That was never a thing.
Right.
That was never a thing for like the first 20 years that the game existed. Now, it's just how it works. But then the OSR comes along and they start to take that away again. And that's like a big design shift. You know, it's the same way that like you look at the way modules were written pre Dragonlance when people were like, no, let's make narratives, let's make characters, let's make rails. When before it's like here's a map, there's a cave, there's a castle, go.
Right.
Um, and that's just how the game was played, and then that all changes, and then now coming back and it's like it's called West Marches. No, Kevin, that's just keep on the borderlands. Like you didn't invent like but like it's fine because people who weren't around then. I wasn't around then, but people are discovering this and they're making it their own, and they're doing different things with it. Um, but like none of this is new. Everything's cyclical. All this design is very cyclical. It all comes around again, and I'm sure in another, like you said, we can't examine what's happening now for another 10 or 15
Yeah,
years, because we've got to come back
right.
and widen the lens.
And I know we've got a tight time limit on the back end of our side, so let's talk about all we've said. All that we've said all those things.
All the ideology.
Let's talk about what that looks like in the pink hack and into the black. Not that necessarily that all is a reflection on that, but that's all kind of prologue into a little bit some of your games. I remember the first time I downloaded Into the Black, looked at it, loved it, and then just saw it was like, this is the pink hack. So I was like, I Googled the pink hack and found nothing on it. So I had to ask you, like, what is the pink hack? You're like, oh, it's just my thing. So tell people who aren't familiar, tell us a little bit about Into the Black. Tell us about the pink hack.
So pink hack is kind of a joke because I came up with this. Basically, it's how I like to run elf games or dragon games, which is a bit of like take a handful of advanced fighting fantasy and a handful of like OD&D BX and like slap them together really hard. So all the games that I was playing were like Jared Sinclair's vanilla game, a little bit of White Hack, um, Red Hack, which is the Micah Anderson game that nobody knows about because it doesn't exist, but it's the best thing that nobody will ever read. Um, and so I called it Pink Hack as a joke because there's Red
Right.
Hack, there's White Hack, there's the Black Hack, there's Blue Hack, there's Lavender Hack, right? So I was just like, fuck it, Pink Hack sounds good. Um, but that was after I had already written and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten the systems for Unconquered and then Into the Black. And Into the Black was when I first came up with the name of it because I basically wanted to write a love letter to the Mass Effect series. Um, but I wanted to make it less about, because my biggest frustration with that series is that it's so rah, go military, which doesn't age well. Um,
Ever.
Never. So I was like, I'm gonna do a love letter to Into the Black, but I'm gonna make it about space capitalism rather than space military. And so I just used the same mechanisms that I wrote for Unconquered, basically, which is like that 3 stats roll under advanced fighting fantasy type stuff, OD&D inspired. And then I started writing this game, and then people were like, "Oh, you got to release an SRD for it. You got to release an SRD." And I'm like, "But the rules are right there, and it's free. Like it's an AshCAD. Why do?" And they're like, "No, like an SRD. You got to have an SRD for these rules." And so I made a Into the Black SRD, and I called it Pink Hack as a joke.
Yeah.
And then um, people were like, "Oh, this is perfect. I need this SRD." And I'm like, "Okay, sure."
Yeah.
Like if that's what the kids are into these days
I,
is
yeah.
system reference documents. It's
I
like,
remember when
sure.
you were asking the questions around it, because like you and I both operate into a very similar ethos. And I was on a panel at one point with somebody from Drive Through RPG's licensing and stuff, and I was like, "Yeah, if you want to hack somebody's game, go ahead and do it. I don't give a shit what they say." And they were like, "Oh,
Yeah.
no, you gotta check in with them." And I was like, "You don't. Like, you can't
You
rip
do
off their
not.
text, but like if you want to use their game to do stuff, you just do it." SRDs for me, and we had this conversation a little bit online. Like, there's just explicit permission, right? And some people
Yeah.
need that because they don't feel comfortable asking. And
Yeah,
like,
totally.
I
And
love
and
that.
I've kind of come around on that now and being like, I get it. There's enough legalese in a lot of games where you think that you like, oh, I'm going to get in trouble if I
Yeah.
use this. I'm going to get in trouble if I use this, and you won't. But it's nice to be able to say like, hey, if you like any of this, or even if you hate it, because sometimes you read something and you're like, oh, I don't like this at all.
Right.
I'm going to make it better. And spite is a powerful motivator. So either way, it's nice to have, like you said, that explicit permission that you can just do what you want. And so that's kind of my licensing document is be cool. I don't have lawyers.
Right. Mine is be cool. I don't like I don't have lawyers, but also if you're a big corporation who tries to rip off my shit, I will hire them
Yeah,
and see.
yeah. I'll find some. I'll find some.
Yeah, Charles Ferguson Avery, we're all filing off the serial numbers. Huge resonance in the chat for that. We got to get you back on sometime to actually come run Into the Black for us. We should set that up sometime because it'd be
Absolutely.
an absolute blast to do.
I'm in the middle of rewriting and shifting some things around to take it from an ashcan to a full release game, and I've got some. I'll tease it later on, but I've got some really cool artwork in the works by none other than Micah Anderson of Bastards fame, who's going to
Awesome.
be doing the layout and a lot of the art.
Very cool. Very excited for that. So if people want to connect with you, find your games, they can go to your website, monkeyspawgames.com. If they're interested in Chapbook Co-op, what's the best way for them to reach out? And specifically, what are the types of things y'all are interested in for that, or the type of people you're looking to work with primarily?
So the Chapbook Co-op, I'll find a link and send it to you. But it's just on the front page of the Monkey Paw Games Twitter page. Actually, I think it's the pinned tweet. There's a card for it. But basically, any first-time publishers of zine-size RPGs, um, especially those of marginalized identities or financial insecurities, um, come to us to get a print run, like a small print run. I'm talking like 100 copies, just to get it out there, to have it in the hands of a bunch of stores around the world, basically, and then either a bit of money or some copies that you can distribute on your own. And that's because publishing is the most expensive part. Like printing costs, especially printing costs, have gone up 40% in the last
Yep.
year. Um, and so it's hard for a lot of people to have the like, oh, I'd love to get copies of my game done. I've got it all ready. I've got PDFs up on itch, but it's going to cost me $500 to get this printed. I don't have $500 sitting in my bank account, but I got together with four other people, and collectively, we can we can front that money to help people get a game printed. So that's kind of what it's about, and that's what we're looking for.
Awesome. Yeah, it's crazy because even with the increase in cost, there are people who will talk to about publishing their game and they're like, "Oh, it would be so much," and I'm like, I mean, it's $300. Like, I mean, that's not nothing, and that's a lot for some people. And that's not a reduction of that cost. But if somebody's already publishing games, the likelihood that they may have $300 in the bank, that were like, if this game is
Yeah,
done
totally.
and ready, and I can just print it, like for me, that's a huge win. Because
Yeah, totally, and that's a win for everybody because
you
there's
know,
more stuff, right?
but but it has to be at that point in time. Like
Yeah,
we're gonna be doing a bunch of system agnostic resources late in the summer, like that we're gonna be putting out on Plus One. Like that's because I can take a print ready project and run them out and put them all out as a bundle of here's a bunch of like systemless, setting and other tech pieces that you can just slap onto whatever you're doing. Like here's a bunch of them all at once. Check them out, like look at them, like if they're ready to go and I don't have to do anything on my side
yeah,
besides get them printed, that's way easier than the amount of time I put into getting a game ready to print
exactly.
and go out. Awesome. So people should 100% go check that out, support it. If you know somebody who's in that situation, who's looking to have a game printed, Linda just did a phenomenal article on a whole bunch of different resources that are out there for that. But Chapbook Co-op was one of them. The +1/mutual RPGs project is one of them also. There's a lot of great ways that people are trying to help do this. I wish we had more time to talk specifically about some of the things that we're matriculating that caused y'all to make this decision. But we've talked about them a lot here on stream.
Oh yeah,
So you can
we'll
go
get
back
into
and
it
look at a
again.
lot of our other ones around why processes like this are so important to helping the scene grow, especially ones that are equitable for everybody involved and not looking to make just massive amounts of profit, but just get more games out there and in print and do it in a way that's equitable for everybody involved in the process. So I want to highly encourage people who haven't checked out Chapbook Co-op yet. And if you have not checked out Monkey's Paw Games yet, you absolutely need to go to. If you are in the U.S., Monkey's Paw Games is in Canada. If you're somewhere else in the world, it's still in Canada. If you're in Canada, It and Ratty, the two of the people who are involved in the Chapbook Co-op pieces, are two of my favorite places in Canada to send games to or to check out games from. So please go check out all the great things that they have going on. Noora, anything else that you want to toss out for folks that they should check out?
Um, yeah, the sorry, brain blank. Uh, very very early wake up this morning. Um, yeah, John Battles, the Sun King, is being funded, pre-ordered on the Nerves website, and everyone should check that out because it's a really really cool project. The book looks absolutely gorgeous, and I'm really excited to see like a physical copy of it because I mean that is one of the best writers in the game as far as I'm concerned, and so I'm pretty hype about that. So everybody should check that out.
I've already backed it and slash pre-ordered it because it has funded, so it
Yeah,
is going to come out for anybody who's wondering. We're also trying to figure out a time sometime this summer to get John on to play it, but head over to nerves.store to check that out. I am super excited about it. It's exactly the type of project I would love to see more about there. And we interviewed Bats a little while ago when they were in the middle of Wizards in the Waste, and I just love everything about their approach to design, but it's far more playable than a lot of other John stuff is intended to be. So all the beautiful words and literary reflection plus highly playable equals me super excited. So with that said, I want to encourage folks to check you out online. What's the best place for them to find you online?
So you can find me on Twitter at monkeyspawgames.com and at www.monkeyspawgames.com for the web store, and also on ttrpg and itch.io.
Awesome. Well, this has been Prestige Class with Noora Rose, and until next time, class is dismissed.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, y'all. Oh, real quick for anybody who's still here, I did forget to mention we've got a couple of great things coming up. Saturday, we're taking tomorrow off. Saturday, we're going to be Black Plains Cedar and Stone, which is another Together We Go game with ZW Garth, the creator of that game, who created for Together We Go Jam. Feel free to come back and check that out. Also, next week, we've got a 2-part Hearts of Wulin stream with the creator, Lowell, of that game. If you're part of the Gauntlet community, you're probably super familiar with Lowell, but if not, Hearts of Wulin is a PBTA game that we are very excited to sit down and play in 2 parts. So if you have not yet, hit follow or subscribe to get notified. If you want to check out our VODs after the fact, feel free to head on over to YouTube to check out past streams or anything you've missed. Thanks y'all so much for tuning in.